Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm going to just shift a little bit away from what I wanted to speak because there was something else that cropped up in the past few weeks before I came here. And I think I must say that all of us have grave misgivings about the way the United Nations is disempowered itself through the way things are happening on the geopolitical landscape of the world, the whole planet, with the big powers exercising control over the Security Council and all the other arms generally of the UN. The UN is also doing excellent work when you look at it in terms of its UNESCO, the education programs, and other aid assistance that it gives, which in some ways is also interfered with now and then by governments, but still there is value in the UN. It is the only body that brings all of us together in the world to look at our planet, which is being destroyed through war and also through the damage that's being done to our environment. And at the same time, it also brings us together here. Those who are struggling for liberation, freedom, justice, not for self-determination is not about for yourself to oppress other people. It's about striving for that freedom and justice. So the point I want to make before I go into issues around self-determination and the experience from South Africa and related and surrounding regions is to make an appeal to all our comrades sitting around this table. We come to the United Nations for these sessions, but we come here as different groups from different parts of the world. And I want to make an appeal that before people leave this session, whenever, that we form a coalition of all self-determination groups that come here. We work very independently and we share the blood and the sweat and the tears of our comrades from other institutions. But as an activist, I can always say from what I've learned in South Africa, if you don't organize and mobilize, you will still remain weak. And we can only strengthen ourselves when we get together. In South Africa, we had this black fist, which we all know from the history of struggles. It has a meaning. It's always been associated with the left wing and with leftist ideas. But the concept of 5 fingers coming together, being a force, is the meaning that I would like to say that builds solidarity, that builds strength and unity. So if you take just these 5 countries that we're talking about today, the struggle of the Turks, the comrades in Western Sahara, Sri Lanka, in Iran, even in other parts of the world. We come here with our organizations all working with respect for each other but separately. We'll continue to do that, but we should, the leaders of these groups and any others, and I hope Bosco, who runs the coordination for our Tamil Eelam people here, is listening, and other comrades, that if you can get together, whether it's tomorrow, next week, and form this coalition, it'll be a message to the United Nations, it'll be a message to the world, that the people who are struggling for self-determination are organizing themselves, whether it'll be at the UN, but through social networks and other media, you'll be able to consolidate what you are doing, what are your programs, how far are you succeeding, what are the challenges, what are your weaknesses, what support can we give each other, and so that we can develop common principles that will ensure that we all understand what do we mean by self-determination, what do we mean by liberation, what do we mean by freedom afterwards, what do we even mean by transitional justice, and how do we build a future constitutional framework for those countries that succeed after self-determination. And also, not to let's hope there will be victories, for those fighting for self-determination and liberation, but not to leave the struggle and leave those who are still struggling. They should be there to continue the struggle and be part of this kind of coalition. It may sound very big, it may sound ambitious, but it can be done. I have already spoken to one or two people, and everyone will agree here that if people go away after the 24th of March saying that we are now part of an international coalition of groups fighting for self-determination in the world, that is a message that will reach the Secretary General of the United Nations, the head of the Human Rights Council here, and anybody else, especially the governments that are here, that are party to this oppression and denial of rights of people, and any other government agents that want to prevent this. So I only hope that we can go away forming such a body, because it will give strength to everyone else. And the point I make is that any meeting of our groups here, whether it's a side meeting, whether it is a solidarity meeting, you would share that in that program. You will draw them in, even if not all of them are there. You will mention them in your own meetings, and you will say, we're not alone. We have A, B, C, D, E, F, G countries that are with us. And that would be the beginning of something that will strengthen the cause of justice and freedom throughout the world and the fight for human rights. So I will stop there because we can develop it. I hope people can invite each other to some other meeting, whether we have it formally or informally, and put a document that can be drawn up, a memorandum of understanding amongst all those who wish to participate and become part of this coalition and group, a solidarity group, and set out basic, not complicated, fundamental principles that everybody can subscribe to and apply in their work, and also share with that form of solidarity. There's so much more that one can talk about there, and I will just stop at that. But I want to just now talk briefly about why is there a struggle for self-determination, and why does it happen? And we know that invariably, not always, it is about oppression and repression by a majority over a minority. And in situations where this oppression can occur through military rule or any type of, we'll say, force that's outside, we'll say, the constitutional formation of a country. Some may not even have a constitution, but they are probably a dysfunctional state. But basically it could come out of force. But the bigger problem, and that's very easy to understand, when there is military or physical oppression and force by one group over the other. It's simple, you can see it. But the more subtle and more problematic area is where it happens under so-called democratic systems. And democracy is no guarantee for justice and human rights. It's about a majority taking power. And if you don't have a democracy that is based on justice and equality, the key is equality, you will end up with conflict. And we know there are plenty, hundreds of countries in the world that are democratic, but they are oppressive. The Sri Lankan government is faced with that same history that they have inherited from the colonial masters, as my brother here spoke about. There are all other countries that have taken power, overthrown colonial regimes that rule them, and set themselves as groups of elites, oligarchs, you name it, that take power, control the wealth of the country, and then oppress those who they want to keep out of sharing in the wealth. So the fundamental issues around democracy, it has to be rooted in a system that is equality of social, economic, and political rights. You can have equal rights politically, but if that political formation controls the socio-economic functions of the state so that they control the wealth, you will still find divisions and breakdowns. If you look at issues around divisions in the country, it's not just that. There are other ways in which countries break down, and all of which I would touch on is rooted because of weak constitutional control, where the constitution is weak, even if it is based on simple democratic principles, and we celebrate the word democracy. It is actually also a dangerous word. I'll just illustrate this point. If you take something that's probably outside this meeting, the situation in Northern Ireland, where you have the Catholics fighting the Protestants, and vice versa. It could be a state that could be easily democratic, but you know that a majority is divided on Christian religious beliefs, and they are going to use that as an instrument to dominate a minority section of the Christian community. Now, what is going to happen? The minority will fight for justice and equal rights and try to break that monopolistic oppression. And when they fail through either demonstrations, petitions, and programs of rallies, and then repression that comes with the military and police, and violence and death, and then we have records, and then it becomes, there's no hope. The children that you grow up with would say, the only way we're going to solve this is take up arms. And it leads to armed struggle. It's a just struggle in the end. But those young children will be called terrorists by the regimes and the governments that control the UN at times as well. The UN has recognized just struggles and has protected those who fought for freedom, like in South Africa. But at the moment, they can blur the things. For example, what they've done in Sri Lanka, not now, but allowing a repressive system to take root and call everybody else terrorist. Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist. And I mean, we should never forget that, about how easily, when you fight for liberation and freedom, you get branded by those big superpowers. And the main people who call Nelson Mandela terrorists were the US and Britain. And they led the Western bloc against the freedom struggles all over Africa and in the third world and in those countries dominated by the previous colonial and imperialist countries. So the point that I'm making is, let's take South Africa as an example.
And Namibia.
Well, yes, my sister is reminding me about Namibia. Let me just touch on Namibia. Namibia was ruled through previously the colonial powers, one of these not so big colonial powers was Germany, and they controlled Namibia. And Germany wasn't that strong as a colonial power, and they slowly relinquished that kind of control, and they couldn't run this empty, big land mass. And so, without going any further, it was handed over to the UN as a protectorate. Because South Africa was the biggest country on the border with a powerful system under the control of the Western powers, that's before liberation, South Africa was given the so-called guardianship of Namibia. The struggle for liberation then began inside Namibia with the people inside, trying to break that control that the UN protectorate, as it was called, with South Africa, and said, we want our self-determination. Now there is an example of pure majority people, all of them, standing up against outside forces, but fighting for self-determination from a colonial concept. and a colonial background. The liberation struggle was fought against South Africa, which wanted to keep Namibia. If Namibia was a total barren land, just a desert, South Africa would have given it up. But it had certain strategic roles to prevent South Africa's liberation. And of course it had mineral wealth and lots of other material that South Africa was also exploiting. We know Namibia fought, and after a lot of difficulties which South Africa couldn't face, they had to give up Namibia. And in 1989, Namibia became independent, and it is a free state with a constitution that's not as good as South Africa's. We know the history of South Africa. I'm not going to go into that. But we came out with what is a process that also touches on this word transitional justice. Because transitional justice worked in a certain form in South Africa, it should not be used as a magic formula or a silver bullet for other countries, which is often being used even in relation to Sri Lanka. Transitional justice is also like a swear word. It's a way of maintaining the status quo and continuing oppression of minorities, whilst negotiations are taking place, while people talk about TRCs, and while they talk about truth and reconciliation, or all the other freedom of prisoners, political prisoners, detainees, and so on, and they bargain for time. It is an instrument that is useful. I don't want to write it off as a problem, but it must be dealt with honestly, and it must be dealt with real integrity. Otherwise, transitional justice as a concept will be destroyed. And we hope that those who are talking about it will remind themselves that it has to be given meaning. Transitional justice embraces accountability at all levels. It embraces time frames. Those are the two things. If they are not followed, transitional justice will just be a problem. And that is what we are seeing with most situations where self-determination is even recognized by the UN, but the UN is in a trap with these oppressive forces and states to buy time, to maintain status quo and delay justice for the people. So we can see that self-determination is often fighting against religious domination. It could be fighting against racial domination. Even if you take Sri Lanka, for example, there's a question of a racial divide, of Sinhalese majority against Tamil minority. Maybe linguistic, but it also has, as we've seen, certain Buddhist religious elements preach a kind of dominant philosophy, crushing anybody else who's non-Buddhist, and so on. We've seen in Palestine the issues there of why is Israel being deemed to be an apartheid state. It is also coupling the concepts of even race and separation to its extreme form. So we have these kind of issues that cause people to mobilize and to want to liberate themselves. And the South African experience, which is a growing one, we are only 22 years in past democracy. Our constitution is not the best, but it is a model because it's called a constitutional democracy. Chair, I will just summarize what it is before I stop. Constitutional democracy, what it is about. It deals with the concept of separation of powers between a legislation that makes the laws of the land, the executive, which is comprised of the ruling party, the political party with its leadership that has to take executive decisions, and the judiciary. The judiciary in South Africa is the most important arm of a constitutional democracy. You write out your constitution, but you put all the laws in there not in the Constitution, but the Constitution will govern all the laws, but the Constitutional Act is the supreme law of the country. It will overrule the religious groups because it won't make religion the ruling authority. It won't make a theologian, whether it's the Pope with respect or whether it's the Grand Mufti of some Middle Eastern country or an Ayatollah to be the ruler who has a final say over the parliament and the laws. It won't make the Queen of England, who's the head of the monarchy, although she has given up her powers, but that's how the king ruled in those days. And even now, in Swaziland, the king is the absolute monarch with the parliamentary democracy, but the monarchy has the power over the democracy. So when we talk about a secular state, a state based on equality and justice, all those people can look after their religious interests, their sectional interests, whatever other things, but the word of the law will govern. And the judiciary must be strong and independent. In South Africa, we have tensions there, but we have one of the best chief justices that South Africa has ever seen and will be seen in time to come to be one of the best in the world. He is strong. Chief Justice Mogoeng, remember that name. He is taking on the executive in South Africa. He challenges the parliament, and both don't like him because he is showing that the judiciary will interpret the laws of the land in terms of what the Constitution says. Not, although he's a very, very religious man, he's a preacher, but he will not mix his Christian interests in the way he judges the laws of the land. That is a classic example. So a constitutional democracy will keep the parliament in check, will keep the executive in check by interpreting the laws in favor of the people. And that is, our jurisprudence is there, all the laws and cases that you take to court. It will force a person in South Africa who wants justice to go to court, not take up arms or not go and break down doors. There are problems we have in South Africa where some of these things are happening, but it is a framework for absolute positive outcomes that will eliminate concepts of division on race, religion, whatever else, ethnic group or tribalism, but it should also embrace something that we should be aware of, and that's economic equality. And if you have to embrace socialism, you have to embrace concepts of a classless society where there's equality in a true sense across the country, you will then have an ideal state. I think Cuba tried and was almost there if they were not subjected to the kind of struggles that they face.
Okay.
But Cuba needed to also be democratic in the way it allows its people to express itself. And if it was given that chance, I believe it would. Thank you very much.